check in with Tony Messenger, St. Louis Post-Dispatch columnist with us every Tuesday and Thursday, and always causing up some type of trouble at STLtoday.com. Good morning, Tony.
Good morning, McGraw. Good morning, Kelly.
Hi, Tony.
We were talking earlier this morning about the 13 members down in Jefferson City that are so offended by what their governor did from their own party that they decided to sign a letter calling for him to resign and overturning the will of the people. However, they don't want to say they signed a letter for fear of retaliation. I don't know what's worse. They're afraid. They're afraid of retaliation is so bad that they're afraid, or they're so wimpy they don't want to acknowledge they signed the letter.
It's both. I mean, the fear of retaliation in the Missouri Capitol is real. It says something about the nature of politics right now in Missouri. But absolutely, look, if you're going to ask the governor to resign, and there's plenty of people that think that there's, enough reason to do so, then you need to put your name to it. That's just, it. Now, you've got a group of House members appointed by the Speaker who are going to hold an investigation, and they're going to do fact-finding, and they're going to ultimately determine whether or not the House goes down the road of trying to impeach the governor, which would be historic. If you believe as a lawmaker that you think this committee ought to do its work, then fine, say that, hold off, on whether or not you're going to make a call for resignation. But if you're going to come out and say that, then stand up and put your name on it. Stand up before the cameras as Shamed Dogan and Marcia Hafner did the other day after Mark Richardson's news conference. One way or the other. But this idea that you're going to call for resignation, but you're not going to release your name, that's pretty cowardly.
Yeah, it's really interesting that they're asking for privacy when they sign a letter, but the woman they're arguing the woman doesn't have any privacy in the privacy of her own,
There is enough hypocrisy in this case to go around, and I think, it's going to be around for months, and we're going to be dealing with that in a variety of ways. I mean, for instance, away from that case, but back to the Confide case, the Attorney General's investigation and the civil lawsuit in Cole County about the governor and his staff's use of this messaging app to erase text messages. There's going to be a really interesting situation coming about depending on how that comes to be. I would guess in one way or another, whether or not the lawsuit is successful, regardless of what Attorney General Josh Hawley says, that there is going to be a consensus that you shouldn't have an app like this on your phone. You shouldn't be destroying public records before somebody can make a determination as to whether or not they're public records. Even the Trump White House has made statements that this is wrong. We can't be using Confide and similar apps in the Trump White House. And so that's going to happen at some point. What's really interesting about that is when the Kansas City Star in December broke the Confide story, a whole bunch of lawmakers all of a sudden downloaded it. What's this Confide about? We want to see what this is about. How many of them are going to be using in the meantime? And so it's interesting you raise this question of hypocrisy when all the eyes are on the Capitol and everybody thinks, oh, we're just looking at Governor Greitens. Once you bring investigators into the Capitol, their eyes are wide open and they start seeing a lot of things. I talked to somebody the other day who didn't spend a whole lot of time in the Capitol, but makes several visits a year and was walking the halls the other day, and he said, there's a whole lot of people down there nervous about a whole lot of things because all eyes in Missouri are on the Capitol right now. And if the governor goes down, nobody believes that he's not going to bring some folks along with him.
The other interesting part of all of this, as they argue that the woman doesn't have a right to privacy while in the confines of a basement, having some type of consensual relationship, and yet I can give the governor $1 million and I have a right to privacy not to release my name, but the woman, she doesn't have a right to privacy.
Yeah, privacy is in the right of the beholder in politics. That's the nature of what's going on right now. And the good news is our system of justice has a court of law that's ultimately going to determine that, has a court of public opinion, has a checks and balance political system that's going to allow the House of Representatives and the Senate and the Supreme Court possibly ultimately to weigh in on whether or not the governor's fit for office. All of this stuff is going to be adjudicated in multiple venues. That's the interesting thing about what's going on right now is you have all of these multiple subpoenas. You've got the civil case, you've got the House impeachment, and you've got the prosecutor all looking at some or all of the same evidence. And it's going to come out, what the governor did, what his staff did, whether or not laws have been broken, and people are going to have to ultimately make judgments as to whether or not this is how we want to practice politics in the state of Missouri.
Jay Barnes, you had an article, column about him. Talk to him for a moment because he's going to be at the center of this investigation in the House. You suspect someone's going to try and go after him one way or the other. But what do we know about Jay Barnes?
Oh, sure. I mean, here's what if Representative Barnes' investigation starts to get serious, then those Republicans who are trying to support Governor Greitens, and there aren't very many of them right now, but the folks who are involved in getting paid by the governor through his dark money committee, they'll go after Jay Barnes and say he's not conservative enough, he's not a real Republican, in part because of the things that I pointed out in the column. He has stood up for the Constitution on his own when all other House Republicans were voting for an incredibly unconstitutional gun bill that would have nullified all federal gun laws and made criminals of federal agents who tried to enforce federal gun laws. Jay Barnes was the only House Republican willing to stand up and say, wait a minute, we all know this is plainly constitutional. I'm not going to vote for this thing. He is an attorney. He is the attorney who, along with Rod Chappell, the president of the Missouri NAACP, represented the Medicaid 23, the pastors that had protested in the Senate a few years ago during a Medicaid expansion debate. So he's somebody who thinks very seriously about the Constitution, and I think he's a serious guy. The other thing that's important here is he's not running for re-election. Kevin Austin, one of the other attorneys on the panel, who's a Republican from Springfield, is not running for re-election. House Speaker Todd Richardson is not running for re-election. That lack of needing somebody like Jeff Rowe, the political operative, or trying to take positions to rally the base because you're running for your next seat, the lack of that pressure means that these young attorneys are probably going to focus on the law, feel much more free to focus on the law and leave politics out of it. And they know that this is a historic occasion, and they're going to be judged on how they handle it.
Yeah. Timeline, what are you hearing how long it's going to take Jay Barnes to investigate this?
That I have no idea. The interesting thing, I was reading the clips on the last impeachment when Secretary of State Judy Moriarty was impeached. I forget the year, but several years ago now, the only impeachment in the history of the state. She was impeached after being convicted in court of a crime. And so that's what I wonder about this timeline and don't yet know. Yesterday, the governor's court date in St. Louis was set for May 14th, which is, if not the last day of the session, at the end of the session. So he won't, if he is to be convicted, that won't happen until after the session. And if he is exonerated, if this thing goes all the way to court, that won't happen until after the session. And so I wonder whether or not the House committee that's doing its own investigation will feel comfortable going forward with impeachment if they believe that's where this thing is headed before the governor's court case has been adjudicated. So my gut tells me this is going to last longer than the session, that House and Senate, they're probably going to have to find a way to call themselves back into session for a special session for this committee to investigate, or maybe it investigates over the summer after the governor's court case. That's my expectation. Is I think it's going to last beyond the session. I may be wrong, but I would find it unusual and difficult for a House to impeach a governor that hasn't yet been convicted.
Yeah. Tony Messenger, always a pleasure. STLtoday.com and with us Tuesdays and Thursdays. Thanks, Tony.
Good to talk to you.